News Talk 1400 and 92.3 WOND presents Midday with David Spatz. Live, local, and relevant talk for your midday on News Talk 1400 and 92.3 WOND. Now, here's your host, David Spatz.
Well, it's not David Spatz again because David is stuck on grand jury duty for another month and a half. So every Thursday, you've got me, Dave Delaney. You know my voice. I am so excited. I'm like a kid in a candy shop. I will talk about today's show for a long, long time. And so I hope you stay tuned. I hope you have a long lunch break today, or, call the boss and say you got a little cold and you can't come back until after 2 o'clock. We're going to deal with monsters and blobs and all sorts of stuff today here at News Talk 1400 WOND. I'm so glad you're tuned in, whether you're listening at 1400 AM, 92.3 FM, or WONDradio.com. I discovered, and if you remember a couple months ago, I told you about Casablanca showing up at this theater outside of Philadelphia in Phoenixville, which is just a short drive from the shore. And I said, what a great theater. But I discovered that they do a Blob Fest every year. The movie The Blob, 1958. Steve McQueen and Andy Griffith's girlfriend from Andy Griffith, Anita, and I can't pronounce her last name right, but it doesn't matter. It's Anita. It was Helen Crump from Andy and Mayberry. So we're going to talk this hour. We got the director of programming of the Colonial Theatre to talk all about Blobfest. And then at 1 o'clock, we've got Gary Gerani, who might be the nation's leading expert on monster and horror movies of the 1950s and 1960s. We're going to talk monsters and forget about all the world and think about the quiche of the movie The Blob. And it was in 1958 when it was released. It was a double feature with, I'll ask my guest. I'm real thrilled. Bob Trate is with us. He's the director of programming at the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. Bob, we're only, July 8th is only like 8 weeks, 6 weeks, whatever. July 8th is getting close to Blobfest. Welcome to Midday at News Talk 1400 WOND.
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate being here. Blobfest is July 8th, 9th, and 10th at the iconic Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville, PA. We're just a little west outside of Philadelphia. We have a beautiful little town, plenty of places to eat. We have this classic 1903 built movie theater where you can come in, you can sit in the balcony right where the Blob killed our projectionist back in 58, technically 57 if you look at the calendar in the movie. You got to pay attention to those there were Easter eggs back then. But we have this iconic, great 600-seat movie theater where you are in that unique situation where you are watching the movie that actually takes place in the movie theater that you are sitting in. So that is a very rare occurrence. There's not many movie theaters that exist today that you can say, well, that's the movie theater from that. And here I am about to watch a movie where someone's devoured in the balcony. That's a little weird.
Are you going to show the Bela Lugosi film before you show The Blob?
Oh, Daughter of Horror. We have shown Daughter of Horror in the past. It is not a good movie. And I think we should leave it there.
Are any of the horror movies from the 50s, 60s, or 40s really good movies?
There are good ones. It's in public domain. It is not we've done it. We did it 2 years for I think before the pandemic. And then we did it 1 year. I think we did it maybe 2 years virtually. We did Daughter of Horror as with all the actors like jumping in and kind of giving you that Svengoolie kind of feel to it. It is what it is.
What was The Blob designed for drive-in movie theaters?
It was a double bill, and the Blob was actually the second picture, the B picture. And,
really?
And here was the irony. Yeah, here was the irony. Shorty Yeworth, who directed it, shot it in color because he wanted the audience to see the vibrant Blob, the creature, so it looks more menacing. And the Blob itself actually changes color throughout the film as it devours more people and things. But the movie it was partnered with was Teenagers from Outer Space, I believe was the first bill picture, and that was black and white. So here you have the black and white picture, and then the color picture is the second picture. And quickly, the two movies changed places, And the B picture, the Blob, became the A picture, and Teenagers from Outer Space became the B picture. So,
and TV Land in 2008, 2009 ranked the Blob as the greatest drive-in movie of all time.
Wow.
So it's like the Blob. So there's so much I want to talk about, but the Blobfest is the week of July 8th to 10th. You can go to the colonialtheatre.com, and that's theater with R-E, not E-R, if you have difficulty spelling the word theater. The colonialtheatre.com. You can get a private Blob screening. You can enter to win that. Or you could participate in the weekend, and we'll get to that. But the genesis of the Blob, when you first discovered the Blob, Bob, what intrigued you about this movie that led to it becoming a Blob Fest in Phoenixville?
I'm a old school video store clerk, if you remember those guys, and I think I watched it once, and I didn't really think anything of it. To me, it was the guy from The Great Escape, but he was slightly younger. And then when I moved to the area, somebody said, that's the theater from the movie. So I watched it again, and I was like, wow. And, I'm literally watching it for the first time with adult eyes in the theater where it happened. And I'm like, what a fantastic experience. And for me, I had a little bit more movies under my belt since I was in college. Realized how great the story was, because it actually is a story about young people who at the time were kind of seen on the fringe of society and the rebel without a cause characters. They were usually the bad elements of society. Here in the Blob, the kids are the ones that come together and say, we need to do something because no one else is going to do anything. But nobody's going to believe us. So we have to stick together to do this and convince everybody else that there's a real danger. And that's totally.
There's deep social thought, and you watch this movie and you're going to have all these social processes going on in your brain about of law enforcement and school authorities and the interaction with young people. And seriously, you had one of the police officers who had some trauma in his life, and that impacts how he enforces the law. But at the end, there's the bright lights, and it's a marvelously deep thinkers type of movie.
It's more than just a monster movie, and I believe that's why it's endured, because you have those societal issues where people have to, how does a kid tell a police officer, this is a problem, am I lying? Do I look like I'm joking? And there's a real issue there, where kids being believed at the time. And we had the screenwriter here years ago, and she talked about those issues, and it really hit me, and it stuck with me ever since, that this is not your typical B science fiction movie where, the kids are the bad guys or the kids are part of the problem. They're the heroes. And that's a very rare thing in a movie from this era. So that's what's phenomenal about the Blob.
Well, and the other part, it's a very, I didn't pull up Steve McQueen's movie history. It's one of his first movies.
It is. It's a weird gray area, because something was released kind of this was shot first and then released after something else. So it's kind of his second film. But there's lots of things with McQueen in this movie. Like if you look at his left hand, he has a wedding ring on. He was just married and refused to take it off. And there's another little Easter egg. If you look,
high school kid with a wedding ring.
Exactly. Well, he's 27 or something like that. And there's another scene where McQueen's you see smoke coming up from behind him. He had a cigarette and he was doing another take, but refused to put out the cigarette. So there's all kinds of little things that if you've seen the movie as many times as I have, and some of our hosts here who have seen it, there's lots of little things like that. It's a great onion to peel, just to pull away the layers and look at all this great fun stuff.
Well, for those out there, all I did to find it is I happen to have a Roku device, and I'm sure it's with the Fire Stick. I just went to my Roku, put in the search, put the Blob. I had 4 different sources to watch it for free. So
yeah, I think it's on. Well, the Criterion Collection has it I think it's on HBO Max because they have a deal with them. But it's on Tubi, so it's great to watch it. But at home and streaming. But here you're actually, like I said, you're sitting in the theater where it takes place. And we have all these other events going on too. So instead of just watching the movie, you're actually immersed in the movie because you're here at the theater, which is it's the best part of it.
Oh, and like I discovered the Colonial Theatre, which again, the colonialtheatre.com. when I went to see Casablanca. And I discovered it because I was looking at a concert, because Colonial Theatre does all these great concerts. And to watch 1940s, well, my favorite movie in a movie theater was cool. But here, the Colonial Theatre is where everybody realized the Blob was real. Before then, it was all this doubt, not at the grocery store, not at the doctor's office, not at this. But all of a sudden, a stream of patrons rush out of the Colonial Theatre onto the streets of Phoenixville, screaming like crazy, pouring out. And there is the marquee, the Colonial. What great marketing whoever worked for the theater back then did. You could see the Colonial Theatre's name nice and clear in the movie.
Jack Harris, who is the producer of The Blob, he actually wrote a book it's called Father of the Blob. And we actually sell it in our gift shop here. And I've read it, and I found this great little passage where he paid them $75 for 3 days to film here. And the owner at the time felt that was an insult. But he made this place iconic. And he has he's given us this marketing and this key to get to all these different horror sites and science fiction sites that people want to make sure that the theater from the Blob endures. And when we had a GoFundMe during the lockdown and during the height of the pandemic, and all these horror sites were like, the theater from the Blob needs help. And it was immediately we were doing fantastic. And it's this great geek flag that we can fly and say, we are the Blob Theater and we will endure. And, we will keep growing.
For people listening, you're a nonprofit organization. Yep. You're not a for-profit theater. It's a nonprofit, the Colonial Theater.
Yep. That our ticket sales just go right back into keeping this place as great as it always has been. So that's what's great about the Colonial Theater.
Now in the Colonial Theater, in the next half hour, we'll talk about Blobfest because, it's like, I just can't wait to experience what that's going to be. That's so cool. It's 3 days, July 8th. It starts on a Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Blobfest. But what do you have to landmarks? Do you have the projection booth? Can people go and see the projection booth?
When you come in, right between our new building and the old building is the original theater. We bought the building next door. Right between the two, we actually have a gigantic poster of the film, and you can't miss it. It's from the era. It's not a reprint. It's an original 1958 poster. It's gigantic. So we have that to market. We also have a plaque that was dedicated that's up outside of the projection booth with a blob coming out of it. So it's brass. You can touch it and all that other little neat things. But we actually have our projection booth is exactly as it was in the movie. We actually have the projectors and they still work. And we run 35 millimeter film here almost twice a month. We do a lot of horror and cult films where we actually run film through those old projectors, and we maintain them, keep them up to speed. We've been told that they're in really good shape by other projectionists that we've come in to do some of our events. And we have that. So not only the marquee that you can do a slow motion run and take a picture of, which we just had a commercial group come through and do, that we have lots of little things like that here at the theater. In town, now when you're here for Blobfest, about 2-3 blocks away, you can go up to Barclay Elementary, and that is the high school that the principal...
Did you break the window like the principal did?
I don't think that the police would like that too much, but you can go up to right to that door. I walk by it every day to my house. You can go to the door that the principal breaks the window to get the fire extinguishers, and you can go to Doc's house. So the doctor, who is the first person who actually sees the blob and believes Steve McQueen, he's helping this man who's got it on his arm, and his house is right across from the street from the library. So you can actually, it's a private residence, but it's a gorgeous house. They've maintained it, and you can actually go there and get your picture, and like right out front on the sidewalk. Those are two locations.
If you see anything that looks like it's sort of gooey, don't touch it.
If I lived there, I would literally have somebody shadowed, like with the blinds coming down, and I would have that up year round. I would have that up year round.
Spoiler, but the doc does not make it. But we have to go to the break. We have to go to the news. Bob Trate's my guest. He's the director of programming for the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville. Blobfest is coming July 8th, 9th, and 10th. Check out the colonialtheatre.com. Great concerts, all sorts. Kathy Mattea's coming in a couple of weeks, or maybe this week. I lose track of all this great stuff that's happening there. But we'll be back with more. Bob, we're going to tell you what happens on Blobfest when we come back, because mark it on your calendar, get your tickets. But we're off to the news.
Hey, Doc Hallen's been killed.
Doc Hallen, what happened?
It's over at his place. You gotta come now.
Oh, wait a minute, Steve. Tell us what happened.
Well, I'm trying to tell you. Now, this thing had killed the doc.
Well, what was it?
Stop with it, kid. But it's kind of like a mass that keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Every one of you watching this screen, look out. Because soon, very soon, the most horrifying monster menace ever conceived will be oozing into this theater. 2 teenagers see it first, like a falling star from outer space.
Boy, that was close. Hey, come on. I want to see if I can find it.
An old man finds it, touches it, and this is the shocking result. From then on, there's no stopping the blob as it spreads from town to town.
Back to Midday with David Spatz on News Talk 1492.3 WOND.
How can it be stopped?
The blob is coming!
You know, and then the world could fall before the blood-curdling.
We're back. I'm Dave Delaney. This is Midday, and this might be the most unique midday you've had in a long time here at News Talk 1400 WND. Watch out, especially if you're in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. The blob is coming. I'm Dave Delaney. We're glad to tune to News Talk 1400 WOND, 1400 AM, 92.3 FM, or WONDradio.com. Bob Trate is with me. He's the director of programming at the Colonial Theatre, but he also knows every line by heart of the movie, because as that was going on, he was mouthing each of the words that were being said in that promo for this great 1958 drive-in classic. Bob, thank you for being with me and laughing with me and sharing with me today.
It's so, thank you for having me. It's so fun. I haven't really watched the movie since last year. And I clips here and there, but immediately my whole body just adjusted to, I'm inside a cool theater and outside it's going to be 120 degrees as soon as I walk out there. I don't know. My whole body just changed as second as I'm hearing these lines and everything. It's such a great movie and it's so much fun, but my whole body just changed immediately by listening to the Queen's dialogue.
As long as the blob didn't touch you and swallow you up and take you away.
I keep a little blob on my desk, and I hadn't touched it in about a year, and I just took it out of the jar, and I was like, oh, I don't think I want to touch this anymore.
We leave the blob alone. Yes. If you're just tuning in, obviously, I just have a fun guest. In the next hour, we've got Gary Gerani, who is one of the leading experts on 1950s, 1960s monster movies, horror movies. He is one of the producers of the famous horror movie, The Pumpkinhead. Gary was one of the creative geniuses behind that. You know Pumpkinhead?
You didn't tell me he was a producer of Pumpkinhead.
Yeah.
Oh my God, that it's so hard for me to watch that movie, being a new father now. But I love it.
So anyhow, so Bob knows Gary's work, but we're here talking about the movie The Blob because the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, the Colonial Theatre with an RE.com, has a Blobfest, a 3-day Blobfest, and tickets go on sale in another week or so. So, Bob, you got to tell us, we're just having a blast, but we got to say what the Blobfest is. Do you have now in the movie The Blob, again, for people who are just tuning in or been listening, we haven't given a whole lot of background. Steve McQueen and his date are out in a wooded area looking at shooting stars. And all of a sudden across the sky is this brilliant light going and looking like it's going to crash, and it crashes with an explosion. Steve McQueen goes into town and gets into a conversation with a police officer And he says, well, you better go out and see what it is. And they go out and find a little dog that looks like Toto. And they find no man. And then all of a sudden they find the Blob is in Phoenixville and eating up a doctor and swallowing a doctor and all sorts of people. And nobody believes the kids. And then there's a horror movie being shown, a Bela Lugosi movie being shown at the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville. And the Blob comes in and takes the projectionist in with the doc and the old man and anybody else. And everybody screams, run it out. So for Blobfest, you get a crowd of people and they run out screaming out of the theater like in a movie?
We do. We have on Friday night, we don't show the film, but on Friday night, we do reenact that famous scene from the movie. And if you just Google the Colonial Theater, the Blob, you're going to know that footage right away because like Turner Classic Movies and the Academy Awards, if they need a movie scene or people running out of the theater, it's that scene every single time. So we reenact that moment where basically, McQueen turns to the police officer and they hear like a screaming and he goes, the theater. And all of a sudden it's us, right there on your screen, right on the big screen. And then all these people come running out in terror because we've seen in the movie that the Blob is actually inside the projection booth, has killed the projectionist, and is now moving itself into where the patrons are.
Yeah,
so we recreate that scene.
Window, it's like, green, red mass, like, all over the place. So on Friday, we got a 3-day schedule. So let's talk about Friday, and then we'll go to the movie a little bit. What happens on Friday at the Blobfest for people who tickets go on sale next Thursday, May 26th?
Yes.
So what happens on Friday?
On Friday night, we have a stage show. So we have a horror host from Maryland. Her name is Aurora Borealis, and her band Beach Creeper. They're going to be here. They perform on stage. They have music. They have little comedy skits. And we just kind of hype up the audience. All right. We hype up the audience. The Blob is coming. And we have like a little story that kind of goes through with her act. And then the Blob's loose. It's now going to get everybody who's there in the theater. And then we enable everyone to run out of the theater in waves, of course, safely in waves onto the street. When you get out into the street, we have it all roped off. It's like Mardi Gras, and you are running with the bulls in Spain, and you are just going straight out and having a really good time. And people are taking pictures. We've had helicopters flying over to get this unique event on footage. But in the stage show itself, we do have a short film contest that you can enter. And we also have the crowning of Mix Blobfest. That's MX Blobfest. That's open to everybody to participate in. And then we have a couple other little things here and there that we're going to do, tattoo contests and that. But this is all part of the stage show. So you get a nice lie back. You get to see a little short films that people have made about the Blob. And then you get to reenact this scene from the movie. And people do it throughout the year. They'll just take photos of them running, but this is a chance to do it at night.
Do you have photographers outside getting the pictures so people can, if they're running out, obviously
you got to come to do it. I mean, you just can't. We have people who just like, why are you walking out? You got to come out full on. We have people in costumes. We've had Santa Claus run out already. We've had lots of craziness, but you really just enjoy the fact that you're getting to do this. And we only have a limited number of tickets for the run out on Friday night. So, you're getting a chance to run out. I've done it with GoPros. I've recorded it. You can watch it all on our YouTube channel and see what it's like. It's just a lot of fun. And you're reliving that moment from our movie that's shot here at the Colonial, which is just fantastic. That's Friday. Friday's just a lot of fun. And then afterwards, we actually have a Blob Ball, which is a 50s style dance that takes place in our new building, which is right next door in our concession stand area, which is a marble floor. And we have a live band. We have swing dancers, and everybody dresses for the 50s. It's a lot of fun. And that's brought to us by
there's a cool bar, by the way. There's a really cool bar in that second building next door.
Yeah.
So the theater's there. Doc's house is there. The diner where they're hidden, where the kids are hidden, and Steve McQueen grabs the diner. What's that really diner?
The diner is really in Downingtown, and it's a Downingtown diner. It says it in the movie, but it's still the Downingtown diner. It's about 11 miles away. You'd have to really drive out of town to go see it. They have it They have a sign that says we are the theater from the Blob. It's just not as close. That's movie magic. I could really spoil things where they turn this corner and then they turn that corner. That's not reality. When he says at the theater and he's at the grocery store and he's pointing and then all of a sudden they're there in less than 30 seconds, that grocery store is on the other side of town. But a lot of it was shot here in the Valley Forge, Phoenixville area in different locations. And Doc's house from the movie is just 2-3 blocks away. And the elementary school, which is now an elementary school, was a high school in the movie. That's just right around the corner from Doc's house. So you can actually walk to those and walk back with little hassle. So you can visit 3 locations from the movie and you'll recognize Doc's house and the high school easily.
Right. You've got a MX Blobfest contest, which I guess that's happening down the street at a pub.
We're Molly Maguire's is sponsoring MX Blobfest, and you have all you have to do is submit a 1 to 2 minute video why you are the ideal person to be this year's Mixed Blobfest, and you have a June 12th deadline. And then the streets are closed off here in Phoenixville starting Memorial Day weekend. We have a stage set up across from Molly Maguire's where we're going to have a lot of stage shows, live acts. We have a costume contest, which is also part of Saturday's thing. So dress up, cosplayers, bring it on out. But that's, we're going to crown a new person on Friday night to be this year's Mixed Blobfest. We've had 2 Miss Blobfests. I said Miss Blobfests in the past during the pandemic. So we do have several Miss Blobfests that walk around and are very into what they do, and they're great ambassadors for the Blobfest.
So when's the movie going to be shown, Bob? When do you get to see the Blob in the theater?
Saturday, we have double features all day with the Blob. So the first 2 double features are War of the Worlds, the original classic that George Powell created. We have that. I think it starts at noon, and then we have another one at 4. And then we have, in the evening, we have an 8 o'clock show of The Blob and When Worlds Collide. So, and then Sunday, you can watch The Blob with the Man from Planet X. So that's Sunday's its own little thing. It's very low key. If you didn't make it to the weekend, you still get a chance to see The Blob. We have a lot of fun things going on, but it's a chance to see the movie and this great Man from Planet X, which is a very bizarre sci-fi movie.
And I'm not a member of the Phoenixville Chamber of Commerce, but there's awesome restaurants in Phoenixville. So, they're not associated with the Colonial Theatre at all. And so the main thing is you get dressed up in 1950s stuff. You look like you fit in now, if I had the hair, I would do the hair back and do the pompadour and all that stuff. So you want to make this is interactive with the guests that are coming to the Colonial Theatre to experience the whole Blob thing. Do you get Blob T-shirts are there all sorts of Blob paraphernalia you can walk in?
We have lots of great merch. We do a T-shirt every year that marks the significance of the films. So we've had a year where we did kaiju movies, where we had Godzilla and Mothra, so they were on the T-shirt. We have lots of little things that signify the event itself. We've got patches, we've got posters, we've got all kinds of things to mark that you were at Blobfest. And it's just a great question when people say, what is Blobfest? And then you go through this fantastic weekend that you have. So we do have our own merchandise, and it's, you can dress up. Like you said, we have people who are in bobby socks, wearing the poodle skirts. We have the greasers, and a lot of the music acts that we have are reflective of that time of music. So they'll play 50s style songs and things, the swing dancing, and we've had it in the street already for some of the bands.
Well, since you lit up when I mentioned Pumpkinhead, our next guest popped in early. So Gary Gerani, Audrey, you can bring Gary in. Gary is one of the nation's leading experts in 1950s, 1960s horror and monster movies. And Gary's our guest for the next hour, but he came in a little early. So if we can get his audio up, he can join the conversation with Bob. Because Bob just smiled when I said Pumpkinhead. He said, Dave, you didn't tell me this. So I don't know if Gary's ready to pop in. I see him on my screen, but I don't hear him or see him actually. So Audrey, you can try and get him connected and unmuted. There
Hello.
he is. Hey, Gary.
Can anyone hear me?
We can.
Yes. Okay, but you can't see me.
No, we can't see you, but I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, Gary.
Well, that's a good point. Is there anything I can do here so that you can see me, or am I completely?
We'll figure that during the news break. But Bob Trate is the director of programming at the Colonial Theatre that's doing the Blobfest, and he just smiled when I said you were behind the Pumpkinhead. So I figured I'd link you guys up for a minute or two. And you can say your impression of the Blob movie, Gary, because this is one of your areas of expertise, are those films and those monster and horror things that happened in the 1950s and 60s.
Well, I'd be happy to. The only thing is, you were expecting to see me, and I'm assuming that's on your end. And the minute you press your button,
we're good. Just talk away. We're good.
Oh, okay. No. Okay, just as long as you're aware of that.
You're live on the radio right now, by the way. This conversation is live.
No, that's terrific. I have no problem with that. No, I'm such a dunce when it comes to some of this technical stuff that half the time I think, gee, am I doing something wrong? But as long as it's okay on your end, I'll be happy to tell you.
So anyhow, while we got Bob and talked about the Blobfest at the Colonial Theatre, what do you remember about the movie The Blob, Gary?
The Blob. Okay. The Blob was one of a few giant blobby monster movies that came out around that period. I suppose the Quatermass Experiment, The Creeping Unknown, was the first big blob movie from that period. But The Blob, because of its title and because of Steve McQueen and everything else, is the one that we often think about. I did not see The Blob when it came out in the theaters. That was 1958. I was born in 53. So in 1958, I was just about becoming aware of these things, But by 1959, I was out in the movie theaters seeing Dirty to the Center of the Earth and whatever else was coming out in 1959. 58 was just a little bit too early for me.
Well, so we want to invite you to come to Phoenixville, Pennsylvania one of these years for the Blobfest, because it's an annual event.
Well, no. Let me. So I caught up with the Blob for the first time on TV. It was on Channel 9 on a Sunday night when it made its New York television premiere in the late 60s. Okay. And I very much enjoyed it. I liked all three films that these filmmakers made. You had The Blob, you had The 4D Man, which is what followed, and then you had Dinosaurus. The 4D Man and Dinosaurus I did see in the theaters when they came out. That extra year or so, that made a difference. But The Blob was a TV experience for me. And, right from the opening titles, there was a big smile on my face, obviously, with that bouncy theme song that came along. And then what you had was a kind of offbeat, rebel without a cause kind of teenage sci-fi movie that was not made in Hollywood. So it had a different flavor and feel to it.
And that's absolutely true, Gary, because Bob, do you feel that that's one of the truths about the Blob, and it has that connection to where we live in the Delaware Valley and outside of Philadelphia, Phoenixville? So Bob, is that one of the magics, is that it was filmed there at the Colonial Theatre, there in Phoenixville and Downingtown?
I think in some ways it is, but I still think that the message of the film itself is universal, especially for younger people. And then, for people who grew up with it, they can remember what it was like to be a teenager of that time. But I think for, obviously for the theater itself, yes, we'd love to say, here's this big Hollywood studio film that was shot right here at Valley Forge Studios and, screened all over the world. I have a French poster for the film myself, so it definitely had legs, and it caught on all over the place.
Yeah, the movie did.
Now, have you ever thought about running the Dinosaurus along with Blob and the Blobfest?
We've run Dinosaurus. We ran it last year for our virtual event. And we also ran 4D Man, and then we ran Equinox, too. We had a full Jack Harris.
Jack Harris, right. You're complete, right. Okay.
We had instead of House of Frankenstein last year for our virtual event, we had House of Harris. So we ran all of his films except for we ran Last Man on Earth on Sunday. That was the different one with Vincent Price. We love Vincent Price. So, I mean, Vincent Price just elevates every movie he's in.
Well, that's a cool movie anyway.
Yeah, it is. But we ran Dinosaurs and we ran 4D Man. We had run 4D Man before in the past at Blobfest. And it's kind of weird because McQueen was supposed to be in that movie, but nobody wanted to work with him after working on The Blob. They just found him. It was cheaper to go with a different actor than it was to hire a whole new crew. So that's why he's not in 4D Man.
Well, you know how interesting is that? Because if Steve McQueen had been in 4D Man, well, be interesting. Would he have been playing the main role, the Robert Lansing role?
Yeah, he's almost too old for it.
Which was a guy with profound insecurities. And it would have been fascinating to see Steve McQueen, who's usually this tenacious kind of guy, playing this insecure, troubled guy. It would have been fascinating. I mean, Robert Lansing was perfect to play that role.
Yeah.
So I guess the bottom line of the story of Steve McQueen was nobody loved the man after the movie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was not. I think McQueen in some ways probably saw it as a small little picture. He took the paycheck over the percentage. Was not a good idea. But how do you know? How do you know? You never know.
Exactly.
You never know. So he took the paycheck and then moved on, and they were kind of like, I think they had a 3-picture deal with him, and they were kind of like, it's cool, you can go, and we're all right. And then they made their money.
When all is said and done, I think Mr. McQueen's career trajectory, he knew what he was doing. He wound up going into, Wanted Dead or Alive and the Magnificent Seven. So but what was interesting, I guess, in the people in the 1950s doing the science fiction movies, and this is something they all say when they're interviewed.
All right, we got a minute. Gary, we're going to keep going with the conversation with Gary, but Bob, one last push to get people to come out to Blobfest before we head to the news. ColonialTheatre.com. Just Google Blobfest. But how much fun is it? I mean, people got to figure out. They were here to us. It's a blast. It's a to-do event.
It's a lot of fun. You'll get new family members when you come. It's just this big open atmosphere that you're just going to love being a part of, and you'll want to come back every year.
And as long as the Blob doesn't take away one family member, you'll have those.
Exactly.
Just watch out for the Blob. Blobfest. Bob Trate, Director of Programming, Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville. Thank you so much for being with me today. I can't wait for the Blob Festival. Then you're missing something in my voice because this show I've been talking about for a long time. And my next guest, who you already heard, I've been excited since one of my friends said, you got to get Gary on. He's one of the nation's greatest expert on 1950s, 1960s horror movies. But I discovered Audra loves horror movies. So Audra, you love this whole idea of movie theater, and you're young. So have you ever seen The Blob? Audra?
I have seen The Blob. I've also seen the remake.
Oh, all right. Now, which one you like better, the remake or the original?
I'm going to have to say I actually like the remake a little bit better. I think it was a lot scarier to me personally. I think that's just because I'm more of a modern horror movie kind of person.
You're a young person and I'm old, So Audra, what's your favorite horror movie? And then I'm going to get back to Gary. What's your favorite horror movie?
Oh, that's a tough one. There's so many good ones. I really like Halloween, the original Halloween. I also really like the Saw movies. I don't know why. They're just kind of entertaining to me. They're just a big gore fest, but it's something.
There you go. All right. Well, Audra, I'm so glad you're behind the scenes working, but I got you up on the air. Gary Gerani is my guest, and we were talking before, and right before the break, we started talking about Steve McQueen and being in the Blob, the original Blob, and that nobody liked. None of his fellow actors really liked him, but big stars in the horror movie. Thank you again for being with me, Gary. And I don't know which website to give, so why don't you give me a website that we can tell people to find more about your work, your books? That you always have a book coming out.
Yeah, I always, one project or another, that's my thing. I've been doing creative projects since I was a child, and I've been fortunate. I've been able to keep doing them all through my professional life. But I would, I'm on Facebook. You could find me right there. I've got a Facebook page. Anyone who wants to get in touch with me just to say hello or check
There you
things
go.
out.
Gerani, Gary Gerani.
Gary Gerani, yes, that is the name.
Or what other way you want to pronounce the name. So,
but that's the correct.
All right. So big stars in the 50s and 60s horror movies, because you've got a change in American culture coming out of World War II and the Depression. And if you go back to the 30s, you got the Boris Karloff, and the classic Frankenstein and the classic Dracula from the 30s. And all of a sudden you skip basically a decade and a half and you start to have these new horror monster movies come out. So big name stars, did they want to have their name attached to them, or did any use a pseudonym and do them?
Well, horror, even the horror movies before the war, major actors generally didn't want to appear in horror movies. I remember Humphrey Bogart was cast in The Return of Dr. X, which is, I think, his only horror film. And I remember him just saying, "What are they doing? I mean, I'm not Boris Karloff. Get me out of here." So it was considered kind of not the most respectable genres, even pre-war. After the war, the atomic age, of course, changed everything. So the scary boogeymen of the classic era, who were magical, they were vampires or werewolves or ghosts or whatever. No. Now we had atomic mutations and alien invaders. So the monster horror thing took on a whole different flavor, a very, very up-to-date flavor in the 50s. And even though they started out kind of as A movies, like The Day the Earth Stood Still and The Thing, even those movies, they hedged their bets a little. Spencer Tracy was supposed to be in The Day the Earth Stood Still, and he begged off. Even The Thing, which was mainly directed by Howard Hawks, behind the scenes, he was producer, but it was really kind of his movie. He didn't want his name associated as director, so he let Christian Nyby direct it, and who was his editor. So right off the bat, even though the 50s started out with respectable major studio science fiction movies, even at the beginning you could tell they weren't quite sure of it. But by the time the 50s started getting along, they really became mostly B movies.
Well, I was going to say that, Gary, because that attachment of you're a B movie, you're a drive-in movie, versus that you are that feature movie. And young people, Audra's age, can't relate to the concept of a B movie or a movie designed for the drive-in because it doesn't exist anymore. So maybe explain what a B movie, or I don't even know where the B came from on a B movie. Why is it a B movie?
Actually, I think it was quite literally the A and B feature when you went to see a movie, and they were generally double features. Your A feature was your bigger, more respectable movie. Your B feature, the second feature, was usually not quite in that league and was supporting the main feature. So that's where I think the term B came from. And what happened was they began to realize early on that science fiction movies, and they were science fiction monster movies in the 50s, were not held in high regard. So they became things either for kids or mainly for teenagers. They were guilty pleasures. And the teenagers loved these movies, as you say, the drive-ins. So if you look at the 50s and you start to see what was happening, not that the better ones weren't still happening as the 50s went on. You got to remember, Forbidden Planet was 56, as was Invasion of the Body Snatchers, a really strong, well-made film. So that's right in the middle of the cycle. But for the most part, they did just become, companies like American International came into existence and were doing,
did any of the big studios do B horror movies, monster? I don't even want to horror movie, monster movie, thriller. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, although if you really think about it, in the 50s, most of the major studios still shied away from it. Universal, which had its big history with the boogeymen from the 30s and 40s, the Karloffs and Lugosi's, they almost on reflex got into the new monster cycle. But Universal wasn't as big and respected a studio as, let's say, MGM or whatever. So most of the studios did have little B units that would put out quickie movies that would be second features, and sometimes they would be science fiction films. So Universal International had their quickie films. And again, they started out more ambitiously with things like It Came from Outer Space, which was a Ray Bradbury story, and that was a little, 3D, it was a little more ambitious. But as the decade went on, again, they started cheaping out too. And when they tried to spend a little bit more money, like Forbidden Planet, which was MGM's bid for a huge science fiction epic, they found that they weren't making any more money with these big expensive ones than they were with the cheap black and white ones. So they went back to the cheap black and white ones, figuring, hey, there's a ceiling on how much money you can make with it, no matter how well exciting in color and all that. No, might as well go back to the black and white cheapies.
All right, we're talking with Gary Gerani, Gerani. You could find him on Facebook. We're talking about the great movie, horror, monster movies, 50s, 60s. Gary is like the leading expert in the nation on this. And you can tell that because Gary just not, we could have 6 hours of Gary and not have enough time to talk with Gary. But I'm glad you're listening to News Talk 1400 WOND 92.3 FM or WONDradio.com today. For midday, I'm Dave Delaney sitting in for David Spence. We've got another Dave on the phone who's called in, so we're going to let Dave talk with you for a second. Hey, Dave, you're on with Gary Gerani. Thanks for listening to Midday today on our Blobfest Monster Celebration Day.
And I remember the Blob. I'm 53 years old, but I didn't see it in the movie theaters. I saw it at home. But the first drive-in movie theater I ever saw was Jaws. I was 8 years old or 9? Oh my! It was what 75?
Something like that.
Yeah. Well, I guess Jaws considered,
driving.
The ultimate big budget
trying to make
monster
a comeback,
movie.
but it's hard.
So do you like the old monster movies, Dave, from the 50s and 60s, these B classics? Audra typed on our screen that she loves B classic movies. Jaws was 1975, by the way. So do you like these old black and white classics?
When I can catch them on TV, I love watching that stuff. What's the Smog? When was the Smog? Wasn't that another one?
The Smog? Gary?
Yeah.
Smog?
Oh, the Smog. Well, there's the Fog, of which there were a couple different versions. And there was
Dave, thanks for listening and thanks for calling into News Talk 1400 WOND.
I like the Smog as a title.
But Gary, when you and I talked a couple of weeks ago, I had all the monster models of the Universal monsters, the creature from the Black Lagoon and Frankenstein and werewolf. I as a kid, I put those all together and I had them all lined up in my room. So it was a connection back to that era of the Universal films. But that monster, off air, we were joking about Bob, who was on the last hour. His eyes lit up when he heard you were my guest this hour because of Pumpkinhead, which is a movie that you helped write and produce. And then you, during the news, said, I got to have my own rubber-faced monster. And I love that line that you gave me, that, your own rubber face. So how much money do they invest in costuming or special effects for these monster movies?
Well, we were very lucky with Pumpkinhead because when we first started to put that movie together, Stan Winston was not part of the equation. So, and we went through a couple different directors. When we eventually, connected with Stan, all of a sudden everything changed because you had one of the world's greatest monster makers now on the team. And that meant that we got a creature that looked like it could have been out of an Alien movie. It was a state-of-the-art monster. And it was in a relatively low budget movie because Pumpkinhead, unlike Alien, Alien was a major studio production that cost a lot of money. Pumpkinhead was a low budget horror film, but we had the genius of Stan Winston and his people attached to creating a monster that really belonged in a kind of bigger, more expensive movie. So there's a situation you're saying, what do these things cost or whatever? Well, we were just very, very lucky to get a creature that looked that good. Back in the 50s, let's say, when Universal International was doing these things, they had their own makeup lab there with Bud Westmore, who bring in all these great sculptors and artists and people. So they had their own unit right there on the studio.
So it wasn't any added expense to create a monster-looking or a horror-looking. They were already on staff and already getting paid then.
Yeah. And they were all experts, especially a studio like that where they've been doing this kind of thing for. But new technologies, came along. When the creature from the Black Lagoon suit was designed, there had never been a full-body creature conceived like that before. So, even though Universal was an old hand with their Frankensteins and Draculas, this was still a challenge for them. But, it's funny. Sometimes people will look at the 1950s films and say, oh, boy, some of the effects look so cheesy or whatever. But they took themselves seriously. There was nothing tongue-in-cheek about the satire and humor. That wasn't part of what they were doing. And that's why they're so great, because they do take themselves so seriously. And you look at these pictures and the absurdity of some of the ideas and some of the...
Is there one that stands out to you as being so absurd and you look at it and say, how did they miss how cheap it looked on the screen? Is there one that jumps out at you right away?
I'll have to think about that. What's like the cheesiest looking? Listen, it depends, because one man's cheesy-looking monster is another man's, fabulous creation. Even the Blob we're talking about, was it rubber cement? And it was like this crazy thing, and he had it dribbling over photographs that were supposed to be dimensional images. You got away with that stuff. It seemed like the kids were just into the audaciousness of the concepts, and they were pretty audacious. And again, in a weird way, they were gleefully subversive, because they were going against the grain of what, like I say, the status quo of what most people felt was respectable entertainment of the day. And these things defied everything. And they were just a lot of fun. The other thing that was weird is, I don't know, when people started making horror movies and then science fiction movies, I don't know if they originally realized how much kids loved this stuff. When the classic Universal horror movies first came on TV in the late 1950s, they were always shown late at night. And it took a while for the TV stations to realize, wait a minute. We show these things late at night because they're spooky stories. You should see spooky stories late at night, right? Not during the daytime, but at night, right? But kids would have to go to bed. And they began to realize when they were showing them at earlier hours, the tremendous kid audience that these movies had, which led to the creation of those model kits that we were talking about. The Aurora models, the Frankenstein, Dracula, creature, whatever. Yeah, it was all...
it's funny you say that, because my brother, who's 3 years younger than me, Psycho used to be shown at 11:30 at night. And the warning would be out, make sure your children are asleep. Now, they say that all night long in the promos. Psycho is on tonight at 11:30. Make sure your children are asleep. But if you think back in the 60s, most parents would be in bed by 10:30. Everybody went to bed like 10:30, 11 o'clock. So what did my brother Mark and I do? We waited until Mom and Dad's bedroom door was shut and they were asleep. And we went downstairs to the living room, turned on our black and white TV, played with the rabbit ears a little bit, and put the volume down low. And we watched Psycho every single time Psycho was on, because it was We were the rebels. We were little kid rebels.
Absolutely. No. Let me tell you something. That whole idea of waiting until your parents are asleep and then sneaking the TV on again and keeping the volume so low that you could barely hear because you don't want to wake up your parents. Well, that was a way of life for all of us kids, in an age before VCRs and DVRs and time shifting. If you missed one of these movies when it was on, it might be 6 months again before it was on. And then if it was on a school night, you were screwed. So and then of course they would be cut and everything else. So, and yet, even with all of these challenges, my generation found these movies and loved these movies and tried to make them our own in a way.
Last hour when you popped on with Bob, when we were talking about the Blob and the Blobfest, the first thing you said was the Blob was like a rebel without a cause. And last night when I sat and watched it, first thing that went through my mind is like, my goodness, this is about rebellious teenagers overcoming authority to prove that they were right. It was rebel without a cause. It was an empowering movie to teenagers who would be watching it at a movie theater or drive-in theater, and that they would say, yeah, here we are, we're real. We're not just little kids anymore. We can conquer this monster. We can figure out what freezes the Blob and stops the Blob from taking over.
Teenagers will save the world. Well, the interesting thing about the Blob is that they set up the teenagers in conflict with authority, but not all authority, because there's like one deputy who's kind of a hard ass kind of guy. But I think the main authority figure actually says, no, maybe we should listen to these kids.
Yeah, the lieutenant of the movie who did that. Well, we're talking with Gary Gerani. We've got another half hour. I wish we had another 6 hours with Gary. You can find his book, Fantastic Television, which is one of those classic books about 60s and early 70s TV. It was written a long time ago, but it's still a classic. He's one of those experts in our nation.
Back in 76, yeah.
Yeah, a long time ago, but it was yesterday, Gary. But we have to go to the news here at News Talk 1400 WOND. You're listening at 1400 AM, 92.3 FM, and WONDradio.com. I'm Dave Delaney, sitting in for David Spatz here on Midday. We'll be back for the last half hour. Stay tuned. Think fun movies. We'll be back here after the news.
Back to Midday with David Spatz on News Talk 1400 and 92.3 WOND.
Welcome back. I hope you've been watching. I'm watching because it's Zooming. I hope you've been listening the whole show today because it's been a blast. I'm on such a good high with, we were blessed in the first hour to have Bob Trate from the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville talk about the Blobfest. And I'm so, he snuck in early to have Gary Gerani since about 10 to 1 and for this whole hour to talk about movies I love and bring back memories. Gary, what you do for a living brings back memories for those who read your work. And that has to be so rewarding because, like I said, Bob last hour, he smiled when I said pumpkin. All I had to say is you wrote pumpkin and he smiled. You have to feel good about the career you've had going into the genre of entertainment. You worked for Tops for a long time, but movies and monster movies and horror movies and all this stuff, you got to feel good about the life you've lived.
Yeah, I was saying before, I was very, very lucky in that I was able to spend my whole life supporting myself doing creative work, which is great because I don't think I could have cut it doing anything else. In terms of the horror, monster, sci-fi thing, that had been in my blood ever since I was a kid. And it never went away because the first thing I ever sold professionally was an article for a publication called the Monster Times, which was an equivalent of Famous Monsters of Filmland magazine, but in tabloid form. And this was like a whole new thing in the early 70s, and the people who did the designing for Famous Monsters magazine decided to launch their own publication. And I was still, my goodness, I was only about 18 years old. But I knew all about this stuff. I was into it big time. And they didn't pay very much, so it was okay to use young kids who were into this kind of thing. And that was fine with me, and I got started. And the very first article I ever wrote about a monster movie was The Creature from the Black Lagoon. But I was all set to write this article in a very scholarly way, as if it was for a film journal or something. But Monster Times was a kind of campy, funny thing, and the editor said, no, we got to make it fun and kind of a little silly and entertaining. So we came up with the idea of telling the story of the creature as an autobiography. I became the creature.
Oh, wow.
And it was confessions of the creature from the Black Lagoon. So I said, oh yeah, I went to Hollywood, and I for the first 200 million years of my life, I was very happy in the Amazon, but then Hollywood came a calling. So the whole thing was written in this very humorous way, which at first I'm going, wait a minute, I take my monster movies seriously. I can't do this. But this was the style of the magazine, and the irony of that is they loved the piece, and they gave me more and more articles where I would become the monster.
Yeah, I was going to say you became
Fargo Speaks. Monster. There was, eventually I became Godzilla, the big G, for a monthly column. Hello, boys and girls. Oh my goodness. but as entertaining and wacky and fun as that was, the best thing about it is I got my job at Topps through the Monster Times. I got my job through the Monster Times. The Topps company, which was the famous company that did Bazooka bubblegum and trading cards and baseball cards and all these other nutty things, was located in Brooklyn. And I got
people
my
may
job.
have noticed, by the way, you have a Brooklyn accent. I don't know if people notice that or not, but you sort of have a Brooklyn accent going.
Oh, do I? Well, this is good. I'm glad I've been able to maintain. Actually, I think it's more of a New York. Isn't the Brooklyn accent a little more like Bugs Bunny? Yeah, what you doing? It's a little more like that.
A little bit, Gary. A little.
No. I am proud of the New York that is still with me. But Topps hired me because they needed humorous gags for their products. They were doing different kinds of trading card, monster movie cards where there'd be funny captions at the bottom. And my work for the Monster Times said, hey, why don't you try this? So I started doing some work for Topps, and they loved the work I was doing and invited me to work for them full time. I was still going to college at the time. So it was the monster thing. One thing led to another. While at Topps, I had the idea of doing Fantastic Television, which is the book we mentioned, my first book, which was the first book about science fiction on television. Shows like The Outer Limits, The Twilight Zone, and Star Trek, and all those things.
And it's still out there on Amazon.com.
It is still out there, yeah.
You can get the hardcover, you can get the paperback, and it's right out there.
Yeah, those ratty old paperbacks are from 1976 are still out there. But what was interesting was that gig, if you will, that book came about through some of my friends at Topps who knew people at Crown Publishers and everything. So it was interesting how one thing, the Monster Times, led to the position at Topps. Then that led to Fantastic Television. It's curious how all those things work out.
Well, now your latest book is Epic Art, The Art of Joe Smith, the great movie poster artist. And there are some really, I was telling you off air, I've always loved movie posters, and for some of the horror movies, there's some great posters. Well, Bob mentioned that if you go to the Colonial Theatre in Phoenixville, that you walk in and there's this huge poster, the original poster from the Blob. So that had to be such a fun book to put together. The art of the movie poster of this great movie poster artist that nobody knows his name, Joe Smith. And he has a simple name. Nobody knows Joe's name.
Yeah, there were two really major artists in the 50s that did this. Actually, the 50s, the 60s, they kept going on. Reynold Brown and Joe Smith. Reynold Brown, the man who painted Bug-Eyed Monsters, he did so many of the 1950s, and he was really the great master. Joe Smith was the other great guy, and they very often worked on the same campaigns. The Day of the Triffids, Joe Smith painted the beautiful one-sheet poster, whereas Reynold Brown did the black and white newspaper ads for the same movie. So these guys would very often work on the same movies, and it was the age of ballyhoo and exploitation. Today, movie posters are usually very kind of snarky and subdued and sophisticated and clever. Well, back then it was just see this, see that, see the other thing, and it made for very colorful and exciting artwork. That is kind of part of the past now. It's considered a little too melodramatic by today's standards.
Well, and also those posters didn't always tell the truth about them. The poster would draw you in. It's like, wow, I'm going to see it. It's like, well, the other day, people may know, every morning I do a 15-minute semi-podcast on St. Paul's United Methodist Church in West Deptford's Facebook page. But it's like, and I did the X-ray glasses the other day was my topic. We talk about X-ray vision from the comic books.
Oh,
where,
yeah, right.
And the ads, or Charles Atlas, you kick the sand in the band, all that stuff. But the movie posters from the 50s and 60s were exactly that type of color and bright and wow. And it's like,
it was the hard sell.
Wow.
Yeah, the hard sell and all the pleasures that went with the hard sell, which is there's nothing subtle about it. It's all in your face, and that can be very, very exciting. As the years went by, things got a little more sophisticated. They would tone it down a little, which is kind of sad. These movies, part of the pleasure of going to the movies when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s, well, not really the 50s, but really the 60s. I was too young. I was born in 53, so I really wasn't going to the movies until 1959. But during that whole era in the 60s and whatever, part of the pleasure of the experience of seeing a movie was to see that incredible poster at the theater when you went there, which, as you say, was often better than the movie itself. So you got two big jolts of pleasure. You got what the poster gave you, which was its own interpretation of the concept, and then you got whatever the movie gave you, which sometimes would be very enjoyable. And it was total satisfaction for the person who went to the movies back then. It's a different world now.
But thankfully, to all the streaming services, you can pretty much Google any of these classic movies from the 50s and 60s. Or again, I have a Roku. Some people have a Fire Stick. It probably works on your whatever cable network box you got. And you type in a name, and it might cost you $3 or $5 or be free. Like last night, I watched The Blob on Tubi, and it was free. And I watched this. I made the mistake of not having a big bucket of popcorn loaded with butter and salt. It would have made it even better. But
yeah, thank goodness these movies never went away. And now, in the age of streaming and the age of home video and all that, you can find even the most obscure ones, which is fantastic. I would like to mention, as long as we were plugging away with my book, let me plug away with something else here.
Sure.
Among other things, I do commentaries on a lot of the Blu-ray releases of films where, I will talk about the making of the film during the course of the film. If you happen to press that button, want to hear about that stuff. I've got one coming out right now that is very, very important to me. The classic made-for-TV movie, The UFO Incident, which starred James Earl Jones and Estelle Parsons, is coming out very shortly on June 14th on Blu-ray. from Kino Lorber. And it's the first time it's been released in this country. It's a wonderful film about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. It's very, very good. But the reason I mention it, in addition to being a really good film that you should pick up and see and enjoy, and I do a really good commentary on how the film was made and a little bit of the background and all that. But on the same disc is a feature-length film that I've just made called Romantic Mysticism, the Music of Billy Goldenberg. Very much like Joe Smith, Billy Goldenberg was a great artist, a composer in this case, whose work tremendously affected me when I saw it. He did all of Steven Spielberg's early TV films. The very first film that Steven Spielberg ever directed, which was the Joan Crawford segment of the Night Gallery pilot, okay? Billy Goldenberg scored that movie. He also scored Duel for Spielberg. He also scored the Columbo episode that Spielberg. So Billy Goldenberg as a composer was the original John Williams as far as Steven Spielberg was concerned. Well, I loved Billy's work. And it was another case where this music had such an effect on me that I made it my business to get to know the man. And then eventually, after 25 years of friendship with him, I said, let's do a documentary about you. And so I finally did. He passed away, last year and a half. But the documentary is finished. I'm very pleased with the way everybody seems to really enjoy it. And that will be part of this UFO incident disc, because he scored the UFO incident as well.
Right. Congrats on that. I obviously didn't know that. In all my research on you and all our conversations, that did not come up. So congratulations.
This is the first. It was kind of a heady thing, written, produced, and directed by Gary Gerani. It's the first feature film I've ever written, produced, and directed. But because Billy was my friend, and every time I'd go to New York, I'd spend time with him anyway. It was fine. Like, come on, let's get you on film here. So that is a very important project to me, and Billy's work to me is phenomenal. Just the way Joe Smith's artwork is incredible.
Because Joe was
found a way to celebrate this stuff and to bring it to the attention of people.
Well, right now, listening to us on News Talk 1400 WND. By the way, I'm Dave Delaney, sitting in for David Spatz. You're listening to Midday on 1400 AM, 92.3 FM, or WNDradio.com. And Audra's back there behind the scenes making sure everything works. Listen to us literally around the world right now to News Talk 1400 WND. Are people who are our age, Gary, who are a little bit on the other side of 40, just close to 40 on the other side. And we have young people like Audra who loves B movies. So I can't think of a more fun thing, especially if the weather doesn't look good, to put together a list of 2 or 3, like an A horror monster movie and a B one. Get some friends, get some popcorn, get some other, get your candy bars and all the stuff, and do a mini movie fest. So what would be a list? What would be a list of some of the movies that you think are must movies from the 50s and 60s, that monster horror genre that people should, if they haven't seen them, they definitely should see them. And if they've seen them, they should see them again.
Okay, well, I actually wrote a series of books called Top 100 Horror Movies, Top 100 Sci-Fi Movies, Top 100 Fantasy Movies, and finally Top 100 Comic Book Movies, which was ridiculous because they keep making them, so that Top 100 was going to change pretty quickly. In terms of science fiction, Forbidden Planet is, to me, the ultimate science fiction movie in terms of its concepts being so remarkable and so dark in terms of its ultimate view of human nature. In addition to creating the Star Trek formula of a group of military guys in their spaceship traveling to brave new worlds, etc., you had the whole notion of the Krell, of this advanced civilization that they start talking about that destroyed itself overnight when it created a way of allowing its own inner id if you will, to take over. The amazing comment that movie made is that even if we human beings evolve into gods, into these Krell-like super beings, we're still going to have that savage, dark side of ourselves that, given free rein, can destroy us overnight. What a remarkably advanced and interesting notion that film suggested. Another major, obviously 2001 is such a remarkable science fiction. It doesn't even look like it was directed by a human being. That movie looks like God directed it, which is one of the reasons why it's so unusual and it stands apart. And another incredible film that I really would recommend is Quatermass and the Pit, which was part of the Quatermass series of science fiction films, but this one, which was this color production that was done in the late 60s, the storyline involved the whole history of humanity, and that maybe our whole concept of evil and the devil came from these horned Martian beings that had bred us ages ago and gave us some of our incredible movie. Quatermass and the Pit, also known as 5 Million Years to Earth. These are all.
What else is it known as?
5 Million Years to Earth was the American title. Quatermass and the Pit is the actual British title. And it's
I never saw that.
It's a remarkable movie. It's science fiction and horror combined. It's very much doing what H.P. Lovecraft did in taking the spooky, scary, magical, dark, supernatural things and combining them with science fiction. Say maybe this was scientific material we haven't quite figured out yet that we interpreted as magic, but in truth, it's science. Really fascinating stuff.
Okay, so for you, Gary, if we go back to the 1950s or before that monster movie, and I've noticed I didn't put the era where Pumpkinhead was produced because you would say Pumpkinhead is your favorite because sitting right next to you is Pumpkinhead's head. I'm watching you with Pumpkinhead today.
I have to tell you, when I did the top 100 horror movies, I had to make a point of saying Pumpkinhead has got to be excluded because obviously I'm not objective here.
Right.
So
I'm
always aware of that.
Go back to your youth and my youth, early 1960s or before. What is your favorite monster horror movie that you would watch again and again if it had the opportunity? You were bored. What I'm going to watch? Oh, I would love to watch this again. So give me one or two from your...
Okay. Well, I will tell you what was my number one choice for the greatest horror movie ever made.
Okay.
And obviously, we have some real heavyweights in there because you've got things like The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. Incredibly, brilliantly made films by filmmakers who are artists and can't take anything away from those movies. But what I chose as number one was Horror of Dracula, which was the very first Christopher Lee Dracula film. And I consider it to be the perfect horror movie. And I would always recommend people to see it. Part of it is that Dracula himself is portrayed brilliantly by Lee in a very limited way, but what comes across is that he's the fallen aristocrat.
And Gary, on that note, we've got to say goodbye. We're going to definitely have you. When I'm back, you're going to come back sometime because we can talk hours. Gary Gerani, Gerani. You can find him on Facebook. His newest book is The Epic Art of Joe Smith. You can find that or find Fantastic Television. I'm Dave Delaney. Audra, thank you. Everybody, please look into the Blobfest. That's going to be a whole blast over in Phoenixville. I'm out of here for 2 weeks. I won't be here next week, but I'll be back the first Thursday in June, whatever date that is.